It was a quiet afternoon in the small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone else. For years, things had been calm, predictable, people kept to themselves, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over fences or during morning jogs. But that peace was about to be shattered, all because of a simple misunderstanding. Or maybe it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. Maybe it was something deeper, something more sinister. On this particular day, a middle-aged man named Marcus Williams had just moved into the area. His moving truck had barely left when he became the target of something ugly. A racist incident that would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. As Marcus walked up the driveway of his new home, smiling at the fresh start ahead of him, across the street, Linda Thompson, his new neighbor, was watching. Linda, an older woman with a sharp eye and a quick temper, had lived on this block for over 20 years. To her, the neighborhood was her territory, her safe space. She knew who belonged and who didn't, and Marcus, with his dark skin and unfamiliar face, didn't seem to fit her picture of the perfect neighbor. It wasn't long before Linda made a call. Her tone was laced with suspicion, her voice shaking with judgment. She wasn't calling to welcome Marcus, to offer a helping hand. No, she was calling the police. Her complaint was vague, but it didn't need to be detailed for her to make her point. "There's a suspicious man moving in next door," she told the dispatcher. "He's walking around like he owns the place. I don't know what's going on, but you better send someone to check on him." The call was placed. The wheels were set in motion, and the police were on their way. For Linda, the call was just the beginning. She stood by her window, watching intently, convinced that something wasn't right. She could feel the unease building up in her chest. How could this man be moving in here? Did he belong? Was he really going to be a threat to the peacefulness of her neighborhood? With each passing moment, her anxiety grew, and her assumptions became more ingrained. The idea that Marcus was doing something wrong seemed to make more and more sense in her mind, even if it didn't make sense in reality. What Linda didn't know, though, was that Marcus was no ordinary man. He wasn't some random person off the street. He was, in fact, the new police chief of the town, a highly respected figure in law enforcement, known for his integrity and dedication to making his community a better place. But none of that mattered to Linda. All she saw was a black man, a stranger, someone she couldn't reconcile with the neighborhood she thought she knew so well. As the police cruisers arrived and stopped in front of Marcus's house, the tension between the two worlds was palpable. Linda stood on her porch, watching in anticipation. She had no idea who Marcus really was, but she was about to find out, and she would be stunned. The officers, already trained in handling sensitive situations, approached Marcus with the assumption that something was wrong. They didn't know why they were there, only that a call had been made. Marcus, ever calm and composed, explained that he had just moved in and that there was no reason for concern. Still, the officers, unsure of what to make of the situation, asked for identification. It wasn't until Marcus pulled out his badge, revealing his position as the town's newly appointed police chief, that the situation began to shift. The air grew heavy with confusion. The officers hesitated. Linda, who had been standing on her porch this whole time, watched with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she was seeing. She couldn't believe it. This man, this suspicious stranger, wasn't just anyone. He was the very person who was supposed to protect the community, to enforce the law. He was the new chief of police, a role that commanded respect. And yet, here she was, having called the very authorities she thought were meant to uphold the law on someone who was supposed to be their superior. The officers were equally stunned, unsure how to react. What was supposed to be a routine call had turned into something far more complicated. They knew they couldn't just walk away, not after what had happened. The awkwardness of the situation was impossible to ignore. But Linda wasn't done. She wasn't about to back down that easily. In her mind, her prejudices had been justified. Marcus's authority, his badge, his reputation meant nothing to her at that moment. It was as if her fear and biases had overridden everything else. She stepped forward, her voice shaking, and asked one of the officers, "Are you going to let him go just like that? He doesn't belong here. What if he's dangerous?" Her words stung, not just because of what they implied about Marcus, but because of what they said about Linda's worldview. She hadn't even taken the time to learn who he was. She had already made up her mind. In that moment, she was forced to confront her own prejudices, her own fears. The officers were stuck in a tough spot. They couldn't just ignore the fact that Marcus was the new police chief. But they also couldn't dismiss the call. They had been summoned, after all, to investigate. "Ma'am," one of the officers began, trying to defuse the situation. "It's just a misunderstanding. He's the new police chief, and there's no need to." Linda interrupted, her face red with anger. "You can't be serious. You're just going to let it go like that." The officer tried to remain calm, but it was clear that there was no easy resolution to this. The tension in the air was thick, the awkwardness palpable. The whole neighborhood, it seemed, had become a stage for a clash of perceptions, one built on assumptions, fear, and racial prejudice. And then Marcus, with an air of quiet authority, finally broke the silence. "Ma'am, I understand that this must be confusing for you," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I'd appreciate it if we could resolve this calmly. There's no need for more confrontation." But Linda wasn't done. She couldn't just accept the reality of the situation. The truth was too much to swallow. She wasn't ready to accept that she might have been wrong. As the standoff lingered, the tension only deepened, leaving the question hanging in the air. How would Linda react to the man she had wrongly judged? And what would Marcus do, knowing that someone who was supposed to be a neighbor was, in fact, someone who harbored deep, unspoken prejudices? The cameras were rolling, the moment was unfolding, and for the first time, Linda and Marcus would have to face each other in a way neither of them ever expected. Would Linda learn from her mistake, or would her biases continue to cloud her judgment? Would Marcus show her the grace and patience that he had been trained to embody, or would he finally snap in frustration at the injustice of it all? The story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As Marcus stood there, his badge still in his hand, the weight of the situation seemed to press down on him. It wasn't just about this one incident, this one misunderstanding. It was about something much bigger. He had known, deep down, that moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood would come with its own set of challenges. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. For Marcus, the road to becoming the town's police chief hadn't been easy. Raised in a rougher part of the city, he had always known what it was like to be judged by the color of his skin, to be treated with suspicion just because of where he came from. But he had worked hard, put in years of dedication, climbed the ranks through determination and an unshakable belief in justice. His promotion had been hard-earned, and the honor of being named chief of police was supposed to be a moment of triumph, a reflection of his commitment to creating a safer, more inclusive community. He thought that in the right environment, he could make a real difference. But in the back of his mind, Marcus also knew that some people would never see him for what he was, a capable, competent professional. To them, he was just another black man, someone who didn't belong in spaces of power or authority. And Linda Thompson, with her narrow view of the world, had just proven that to him. As the officers on the scene attempted to ease the tension, one of them, Officer Davis, stepped forward to speak to Marcus. Davis was young, just a couple of years into the force. He had always been a by-the-book type, someone who followed orders and kept his head down. He was clearly uncomfortable in this situation, and it showed. "Chief, I think we should wrap this up," Davis said quietly. "There's no need to make this any worse. You've got your badge and, well, we know who you are. I think we can leave it at that." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. He could feel his patience wearing thin. "It's not about making it worse, officer. It's about making sure that what happened here today doesn't go unaddressed." People like her, he motioned toward Linda, who had stepped back a few feet, still watching intently from the porch, need to understand that this kind of behavior, this kind of thinking, isn't acceptable. It can't just be brushed aside. Linda was still staring, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression one of disbelief. She was the embodiment of someone caught between their beliefs and the reality of the situation, a person who had spent years building up a certain worldview only to have it suddenly, violently shattered. It wasn't just that Marcus was black. It was that he was black and in charge. That was what seemed to really shake her. Her entire perception of authority, of what was supposed to be normal, was suddenly called into question. In her mind, this man had flipped everything upside down. The silence between them was heavy. Marcus could feel her eyes on him, sharp and searching, but he refused to meet her gaze. Instead, he focused on the officers, trying to remain composed despite the knot that was forming in his stomach. He had expected challenges in this job, but not this. Not here. Not in the place where he had hoped to make a fresh start. Meanwhile, Linda remained rooted to her spot. She wasn't ready to let go of her own feelings of superiority, her assumptions that people like Marcus were out of place in her world. The whole neighborhood had known her as a fixture, an authority figure in her own right. She wasn't about to allow someone like Marcus to disrupt the peace she had come to expect. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke, her words laced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, but her tone betrayed her true feelings. "I just thought, well, you don't exactly see people like you around here." The last part of her sentence hung in the air, uncomfortable and awkward. Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he knew better than to let it take control. The way she spoke, as if his mere presence in this neighborhood was a disruption, wasn't surprising. He had encountered it before, in different forms, but it never stopped stinging. What bothered him most, however, was the underlying assumption that he had no right to be here, that he didn't belong in this peaceful suburban environment just because of his skin color. "People like me," Marcus repeated quietly, his voice calm but firm. "What do you mean by that?" Linda's face flushed. She had been caught, but she wasn't ready to admit it. She looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze directly. "You know what I mean," she muttered under her breath. "This just doesn't feel right. I've lived here for years, and things have always been a certain way. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but—" Her words trailed off, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and sadness. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about a worldview that had been formed over decades. It was about an unwillingness to see beyond one's own biases, even when confronted with undeniable evidence to the contrary. Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing between Marcus and Linda. He knew this wasn't going to end easily. The air between them was thick, charged with unspoken tensions. "Maybe we should all just take a step back," Davis suggested, his voice tentative. "We can all just go our separate ways, and this will be behind us." But Marcus wasn't ready to walk away just yet. "No," he said, his tone more resolute now. This isn't something that just goes away. This kind of thinking, it has consequences, and I'm not going to stand by and let it slide. The officers exchanged nervous glances. They were caught in the middle, not knowing how to navigate the fine line between doing their job and addressing the racial dynamics at play. They were well-meaning, but they didn't know what it felt like to walk in Marcus's shoes. They didn't understand the weight he carried, the burden of being judged before you even had a chance to prove yourself. Linda took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice cold, more resolute now. "This is my neighborhood. I'm not going to let you." Before she could finish, Marcus held up his hand. "Let me make this very clear," he said slowly. "This isn't about you or your neighborhood. This is about what's right. You don't get to decide who belongs here just based on what you think you know. I'm here because I earned my place, and I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows that." Linda recoiled, the sting of his words cutting through her like a sharp blade. But Marcus wasn't finished. "And as for your call to the police, I'll be reporting this because this kind of behavior has to be addressed. It's not just about me. It's about how we treat each other as neighbors, as human beings." The tension in the air felt suffocating, and for a moment, neither side knew what to say next. Marcus could see that Linda was struggling to process everything, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and resentment. As for the officers, they remained quiet, unsure of how to mediate a situation that was far more complex than any of them had anticipated. And so the standoff lingered, unanswered questions hanging in the air. What would Linda do now that she had been confronted with the truth? Would Marcus's commitment to justice be enough to shift the tide, or was this just the beginning of an even deeper conflict? For now, all they could do was stand there, each one wondering how the situation would unfold, and whether they could find a way to move forward without losing something far more important than their pride. The silence that stretched between Marcus and Linda felt like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Linda stood rigid, her arms still folded across her chest, her eyes locked on Marcus, unable to fully process the gravity of the moment. She was a woman who prided herself on knowing the dynamics of her neighborhood, and this situation had rattled everything she believed about who belonged and who didn't. Marcus, on the other hand, stood his ground, his jaw clenched, but his mind was racing. He had spent years earning the respect of his colleagues, working tirelessly to climb the ranks of law enforcement, but never had he felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Linda's prejudice wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a glimpse into the darker undercurrents of the town he had sworn to protect. The officers, having taken a step back to let the confrontation unfold, were now quietly observing. Officer Davis, still young and unsure of how to handle this delicate situation, fidgeted nervously. He had joined the force with an idealistic view of serving his community, believing that police work was about protecting people, not navigating deep-seated social issues. But today, he was beginning to realize that the job was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He had never been in a situation like this before, where personal biases seemed to clash so violently with the ideals of justice. Davis glanced at his partner, Officer Carter, who had been quiet up until this point. Carter was older, more experienced, but even he seemed uncertain. "What do we do now?" Davis whispered, his voice barely audible. Carter shrugged, his expression grim. "We let them work it out. It's not our place to get in the middle. But it's going to change things, one way or another." Back on the porch, Linda's face was flushed, her mind a battlefield. She couldn't shake the discomfort that had settled in her chest. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about her, about how she saw the world. For the first time in years, Linda felt the ground beneath her feet shifting, and she didn't like it. The certainty that had always guided her actions was being called into question, piece by piece, and she wasn't ready to let go of that old worldview. "I don't understand why you're making this so difficult," Linda finally said, her voice quieter now, but still firm. "I'm just looking out for this neighborhood. It's always been a good place to live. Nothing out of the ordinary, no surprises. And now you show up, out of nowhere. I don't know you. I don't trust you." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had dealt with people like Linda before, people who saw the world in black and white, who couldn't see beyond their own biases. But this wasn't just about him. This was about a community that had to evolve, had to confront uncomfortable truths, if it was ever going to truly be a place where everyone could feel safe. "You're right," Marcus said slowly, his voice steady, though a fire burned beneath the surface. "You don't know me, and I get it. But that's the problem, isn't it? You're deciding who belongs here based on your assumptions, your fears, your biases." He paused, meeting her eyes. "But that's not how a community works. A community is supposed to be about trust. It's about acceptance, and I'm here to protect that." Linda flinched as if his words had struck her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Something in the air had shifted. It was as if Marcus had cracked open a door she wasn't prepared to face, and now she wasn't sure how to shut it again. Behind the scenes, there were other forces at play, unseen but deeply felt. Marcus knew that his arrival in this neighborhood, his appointment as police chief, had already caused a ripple of discomfort among some of the town's residents. While he had hoped his leadership would be a catalyst for change, he hadn't anticipated the depth of resistance he would encounter. People like Linda weren't the only ones who viewed his promotion with skepticism. There were whispers in the town's corners, questions about his qualifications, his background. Some believed he had been given the job simply because of his race. Others worried about the changes he might bring to a town that had remained comfortably set in its ways for decades. The divide was subtle but present, fueled by years of ingrained biases and old attitudes that were hard to shake. As much as Marcus had hoped to be a force for unity, there were some in the town who had already decided he was an outsider, a figure who threatened the status quo. They hadn't seen him as the capable, experienced police officer he was. Instead, they saw him as a symbol of something they feared, a shift in the balance of power they didn't fully understand. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. Not now. His commitment to his role as chief of police went beyond the badge. It was about creating a town where people of all races and backgrounds could feel respected and valued. But he also understood that change was never easy. It required patience, understanding, and most of all, courage. As the officers stood by, unsure of how to move forward, a figure emerged from the shadows of the street. A tall man in his mid-40s, wearing a suit and tie. His presence was commanding, and his footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing with purpose. The man was Mayor Thomas Pierce, the very person who had appointed Marcus as police chief. Mayor Pierce had been watching from a distance, his eyes scanning the scene. He had heard about the incident earlier, but hadn't intervened, believing that Marcus could handle it. But now, seeing the tension between Marcus and Linda, he realized that this situation needed to be addressed head-on. He approached the group, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze flickering between Linda and Marcus. Linda's eyes darted to the mayor, and for the first time, she seemed to shrink back. I don't know," she stammered. "This whole situation is just strange. I don't think he belongs here, Mayor. He's not one of us." The words hung in the air, sharp and divisive. Marcus could feel his heart rate quicken, but he remained composed, his gaze never leaving the mayor. Pierce's expression was unreadable, but his next words were directed at Marcus. "Chief Williams, why don't you take a walk with me? Let's give Mrs. Thompson some time to process all of this." Marcus nodded, but inside, he felt a pang of frustration. He wasn't interested in walking away from this confrontation, not when it was so clear that Linda's prejudice needed to be confronted directly. But he also understood the mayor's position. Pierce was trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further. As the two men walked away from Linda's porch, Pierce spoke quietly, his voice low and measured. "I know this is difficult, Marcus. But you have to understand, some people around here aren't ready for the changes you're bringing. It's going to take time, and there will be more moments like this." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides. "I didn't sign up for time. I signed up to make a real difference." The mayor paused, glancing over his shoulder at Linda, who was still standing on the porch, watching them go. "And you will, Chief, but don't expect it to happen overnight. Not everyone is going to see things your way, especially not someone like her." Marcus said nothing, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't need the mayor to tell him that. What he needed was for Linda, and everyone like her, to understand that real change couldn't be put off, ignored, or swept under the rug. It had to happen, whether they were ready or not. As they reached the corner of the street, the mayor turned to Marcus, his tone softening. "Just remember, you're not in this alone. You have my support. But this isn't just about your work. It's about the people, their hearts, and their minds. You have to be patient. You have to be steady." Marcus nodded again, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The journey ahead would be long. There would be more challenges, more resistance. But he was determined. He couldn't let people like Linda, and the fears they represented, win. As Marcus and Mayor Pierce walked away from the scene, the tension between them seemed to hang in the air, thick and unresolved. The quiet was unnerving, almost oppressive. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the frustration building in his chest. He had hoped that his promotion, his appointment as police chief, would be the start of something meaningful, not just for him, but for the whole town. But the reality was far more complicated. Linda's prejudices were only the tip of the iceberg, and he could sense that there were many more who thought like her, who feared change. Mayor Pierce seemed calm on the outside, but Marcus could tell that the situation had rattled him as well. The mayor was a man of diplomacy, a seasoned politician who had spent years keeping the peace in the town. But even he couldn't ignore the brewing storm. As they reached the end of the block, Pierce stopped and turned to face Marcus. "I don't want you to think this is just about you, Marcus," the mayor said, his voice lowering. "This town, this whole community, it's not ready for what you're trying to do. People like Linda, they represent a larger mindset. And those kinds of minds, well, they don't change overnight." Marcus wanted to respond, to argue, to express just how deeply he believed in his mission. But the words wouldn't come. The pain of being judged for the color of his skin, for the simple fact that he was trying to do his job, was still raw. And now it was clear that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a battle for the very soul of the town. He tried to steady his thoughts. "I can't just back down. If I let this go, then what does that say to everyone else who's been looking for a change? What does it say to the people who believe that things can actually be different here?" Pierce sighed, a look of exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to back down. I'm asking you to understand that change takes time. Some people, maybe even most people, will need to come to terms with it on their own. You can't force it." Marcus knew the mayor was right. He knew change couldn't be rushed. But the fire inside him burned brighter with every passing moment. He had worked his whole life for this. He wasn't about to let people like Linda define what his community could be. He had to make them see that his authority was earned, not given. That he was more than just the man standing in front of them. He was the man who would change everything. "I'll take my time," Marcus said, his voice quiet but determined. "But I'm not backing down." Pierce gave him a long, measured look. "Just be careful. I know what you're trying to do, but there are forces in this town, forces that will fight back hard. I've seen it before, and I don't want you caught in the crossfire." The words hung in the air, warning him of something he couldn't yet fully understand. He nodded stiffly and turned away, needing space, needing time to think. The silence between him and Pierce grew as the mayor stepped back, watching Marcus go. But Marcus wasn't alone in feeling the weight of what was happening. Back at Linda's house, she stood at the window, her hand gripping the curtains tightly. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts racing. What had just happened? She had tried to do what she thought was right, what she had always done, by protecting the neighborhood from someone she didn't understand. But now she was beginning to realize that maybe she hadn't been right after all. The discomfort that had settled in her chest earlier had now turned into a heavy knot. She had never imagined that a simple call to the police would unravel everything so quickly. But there it was, Marcus had been right. Her actions, her assumptions, were built on a shaky foundation. The whole town was changing, and she was scared. But it wasn't just fear of the unknown that held her back. It was the loss of control, the loss of power. She hadn't just judged Marcus. She had judged an entire future. She had judged what the town could be, what it could become. And now she was faced with the terrifying possibility that she had been wrong. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about her too. It was about whether or not she could accept this new reality, whether or not she could truly see Marcus for who he was, and not just for what she had assumed he was. Could she make peace with the changes that were happening around her, or would she continue to fight them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. She froze for a moment, then reluctantly opened it, her eyes avoiding the visitor's gaze. It was another neighbor, someone who had witnessed the whole thing. His face was stern, and there was an uncomfortable silence between them. "You all right, Linda?" the man asked, his voice low. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if she was all right. She had never felt more conflicted in her life. She nodded quickly, forcing a tight smile. "I'm fine. Just a little shaken up, that's all." The man didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. "Listen, I heard what happened. And I think you should be careful. People around here are talking. And not just about Marcus. About you." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "Talking about me," she repeated, her voice rising in panic. "What do you mean?" The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the street nervously. "There's a lot of tension. People are upset. Some of them don't agree with what you did, and they're looking for someone to blame." Linda's stomach twisted with dread. She had never imagined that her actions would lead to this, a community divided, neighbors at odds with each other. She had always prided herself on knowing what was best for the neighborhood. But now it felt as if she was being judged, scrutinized, in the very place she had once felt safe. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to protect what we had here." The man's expression softened, but there was an edge to his voice. "I know, but sometimes the things we think we're protecting end up hurting us in the end. You need to think carefully about how you handle this from here on out." Linda's mind reeled. Was she really the one who had caused this rift? Was it possible that everything she had believed in, everything she had fought for, was wrong? And if it was, what would that mean for the future? What would it mean for the town? The storm that had started with a single phone call was now swirling into something far more dangerous. As Linda closed the door, the weight of her decisions pressing heavily on her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Across town, Marcus was facing his own storm. The weight of his responsibilities was starting to feel unbearable. He had made it this far, but the battle was only just beginning. He could sense the resistance growing, the undercurrents of dissent in the community. And it wasn't just Linda anymore. It was the whole town, divided, unsure of what direction it should go. But Marcus was more determined than ever. He knew that the path ahead would be rocky, that there would be people who would fight him every step of the way. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, was on the line. The time for compromise was over. The time for action was now. And as the tension in the town continued to build, the question remained, who would ultimately win? The forces of change or the resistance to it? The stage was set for a showdown, and it was coming faster than anyone could have imagined. The days following the tense confrontation felt like an endless cycle of uncertainty, each one dragging Marcus deeper into a web of tension he hadn't anticipated. The town was divided, not just over his position as police chief, but over the very nature of what it meant to be part of the community. People like Linda were vocal in their discontent, but they were not alone. As he had feared, whispers began circulating, and resistance to his leadership began to take a more organized shape. It wasn't just a few individuals who had issues with him. It seemed like a whole faction of the town was rising against him. Marcus could feel the undercurrent of hostility, the way some people looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention. It was subtle but unmistakable, a glance, a whispered word, a nod of agreement that lingered too long. And it wasn't just about race anymore. It was about power, control, and the very future of the town. The shift he had hoped for was starting to feel more like an insurrection. People weren't just uncomfortable with the idea of a black man in charge. They were scared. And that fear was starting to take a more dangerous form. It began with small acts of sabotage, late-night graffiti on the walls of the police station, tires slashed on Marcus's personal vehicle. Nothing overtly threatening, but just enough to send a message. The kind of message that said, "We don't want you here." It wasn't just some random act of vandalism. It felt coordinated, like someone was trying to break his resolve, to make him feel like he was alone in this fight. But it wasn't until the anonymous letter arrived that the true depth of the hostility became clear. The letter was left in his office, carefully folded in an envelope with no return address. Marcus opened it slowly, almost afraid of what it might say. As he read the words, a chill ran down his spine. It was a warning, written in angry, sharp letters that had been cut from newspapers and pasted onto the page, a crude, threatening message. "We see you, and we know what you're trying to do. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. This town belongs to people who've been here, not to outsiders like you. Don't make us take matters into our own hands." The letter was a direct threat. It wasn't just about his role as chief, it was personal. This wasn't some isolated act of rebellion. This was the manifestation of a deep-rooted fear of change, of losing control. But there was something even more unsettling about the letter, the way it was written. The fact that someone had gone through the trouble of cutting out each letter, like they were trying to hide their identity. It was methodical. It was deliberate. and it made him feel more isolated than ever. Marcus stared at the letter, his mind racing. Was this just the work of one person, or was there a group behind this? Was the hostility he had felt in the town simply a few loud voices, or was it something deeper, something more insidious? The next day, things escalated even further. While Marcus was reviewing the department's reports in his office, a call came through on his phone. It was from Officer Davis, the young cop who had been with him at Linda's house. There was urgency in his voice, and Marcus immediately sensed something was wrong. "Chief, you need to get over here," Davis said, his voice tight with tension. "There's been an incident. At the park. It's bad." Marcus didn't waste a second. He grabbed his jacket, bolted out of his office, and headed for the scene. The drive felt like it took forever, every passing moment heightening his sense of dread. The park was just a few miles from the police station, a popular place for families and joggers. As he pulled up to the entrance, he could already see the flashing lights of squad cars and the gathering crowd of onlookers. Something was terribly wrong. When he approached Davis, the officer was standing by the yellow police tape, looking more pale than usual. "Talk to me," Marcus said, his voice sharp with urgency. Davis didn't immediately respond, his eyes flickering toward the park in front of them. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with disbelief. "There's a body. A man. Looks like a gunshot wound to the chest." Marcus's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, a body? Who is it?" "We're still trying to ID him," Davis replied, stepping aside to let Marcus through the tape. "But there's something else. The body. It's one of the town's regulars. He was a local maintenance guy, worked the parks for years. Nice guy, everybody knows him." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a sinking feeling in his gut. It wasn't just the murder. It was the fact that it involved someone the community knew, someone they trusted. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was personal. As they moved closer to the scene, Marcus could see the body lying in the grass, the blood still fresh, pooling around the man's chest. He was in his 50s, wearing a uniform with the town's logo. His face was still. His eyes were wide open in shock, forever frozen in a moment of terror. But it wasn't the body that stopped Marcus in his tracks. It was the message. The victim's hand had been placed on his chest, his fingers clutched tightly around something, a small crumpled piece of paper. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he reached down and carefully unfolded the note. It was the same kind of letter, the same cut-out newspaper letters, the same threat. "This is just the beginning. Keep pushing, and there'll be more." Marcus's blood ran cold. The threat was no longer vague. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were willing to kill to make their point. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The stakes had just gone through the roof. The resistance he had been facing wasn't just about disliking him as chief. It was about something much darker. This was no longer a political or social fight. It was a personal war, and he was the target. His mind raced. Who would go this far? Who in the town had so much fear and hatred of him that they were willing to escalate things to murder? Was it Linda's group, or was it someone else entirely? The letter, the timing, it felt deliberate. It felt orchestrated. He turned to Davis, his voice low and deadly serious. "Get forensics out here. And I want you to start digging into anyone who might have had a problem with this guy. Everyone who knew him." Davis nodded, his face pale. "You think this is connected to you, Chief?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. But what he did know was this. Whoever was behind this was willing to go to any lengths to stop him. And the game had just changed. As he walked away from the scene, his mind reeled. This wasn't just about a neighborhood or a small-town police force anymore. This was about power, control, and the violent lengths to which some people would go to protect the status quo. And if Marcus didn't act quickly, if he didn't find out who was behind this, it might not just be his career on the line. It could be his life. The clock was ticking, and every moment brought him closer to a dangerous confrontation. The question wasn't just whether he could survive this. It was whether he could stop the town from tearing itself apart in the process. The days after the murder at the park felt like a blur to Marcus. Every moment was a whirlwind of police reports. Interviews and late nights spent poring over every detail, every lead. The threat was no longer just a series of intimidating notes. It was a bloodied reality. The town was on edge, and Marcus could feel the pressure mounting from every direction. People were afraid, their fears manifesting in anger, in whispers, in acts of violence. But Marcus wasn't backing down. Not now, not after everything he had fought for. The investigation into the murder quickly uncovered troubling details. The victim had been well-liked by everyone in town. He'd worked for years maintaining the parks, often stopping to chat with residents about the weather, the town's sports teams, or whatever small-town gossip was trending that day. No one had any reason to hurt him, until the note, the same type of letter that had been sent to Marcus, had been found in his hand. Someone had used him as a pawn in a much larger game, sending a message not just to Marcus, but to the entire town. The hours bled into each other as Marcus dived deeper. He knew the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind these threats wasn't done. They wouldn't stop at just one victim. But the question weighed heavily on him, who could have orchestrated such a violent act. And why the park worker? What did he have to do with anything? Then one night, a breakthrough came. Davis, who had been tirelessly following leads, called him with news that would change everything. "Chief, I think we've got something," Davis said, his voice shaky but determined. "You're gonna want to see this." Marcus drove to the precinct immediately, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, Davis was waiting for him with a stack of papers, his expression grim. He handed Marcus a printout. It was a list of names, and at the top of that list was a name Marcus never thought he'd see. Linda Thompson. The list was a collection of residents who had recently made donations to an anonymous fund, one that had been set up to protect the integrity of the town. A group that had been operating under the radar for weeks, even months. The amounts donated were small at first, but the most recent transactions had been substantial. Marcus had heard of similar groups in other towns, groups that fostered fear, stoked division, and tried to push out anyone they deemed unfit to be in charge. And it wasn't just Linda. The names on the list included several other well-known figures in the town, people who had been outwardly friendly to Marcus, but who, it seemed, were quietly fueling the very fire that sought to destroy him. It made sense now. The coordinated sabotage, the threats, the murder. They were all part of something larger, something deeper than Marcus had initially realized. The resistance he was facing was no longer just about his role as chief. It was about a group of people trying to reclaim power and control in the town. People who weren't willing to accept a black man in charge, no matter how qualified he was. Marcus felt the weight of the betrayal like a physical blow. Linda, she had been the first to call the cops on him, the first to challenge him. And now it turned out she had been funding a covered operation aimed at undermining everything he had worked for. The shock of it was overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell. He had to act fast. He couldn't allow this conspiracy to spread any further. The next morning, Marcus held an emergency meeting with his officers. He briefed them on what they had uncovered and outlined a plan to move forward. They would need to gather evidence, confront the group head-on, and shut down their operation. It wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was prepared for the fight. He had been ready for this moment, even if he hadn't fully understood what he was up against. They worked quickly, securing warrants and making arrests. The town was rocked by the news, but there was no going back. Linda Thompson was arrested first. When she was brought in for questioning, her face was a mixture of shock and defiance, as if she had expected this day to come, but had never truly believed it would. She denied everything, of course, but the evidence was damning. The deeper they dug, the more names they uncovered. The Anonymous Fund wasn't just a local initiative. It was connected to a larger network of right-wing groups that had been quietly gaining ground across the region. The conspiracy was bigger than Marcus had ever imagined, and he was only beginning to see the full scope of what they had been planning. As the arrests piled up and the community began to reel from the revelations, Marcus started to feel a sense of victory. But there was something else gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. In the midst of all the chaos, in the wake of the arrests and the media frenzy, a final twist came. It was a call from the mayor. "I think we need to talk," Mayor Pierce said when Marcus picked up. His tone was flat, businesslike, in person. The unease Marcus had been feeling only grew as he drove to the mayor's office. The man had been supportive, at least outwardly. But now something about the conversation felt off. When Marcus entered the mayor's office, Pierce was standing by the window, looking out at the town. The mayor's posture was stiff, almost defensive, and when he turned to face Marcus, there was an odd look in his eyes, something unreadable. "Marcus," the mayor began slowly, "I know this whole situation has been hard on you, and I'm sure you're feeling some sense of triumph with everything that's come to light. But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago." Marcus's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Pierce took a deep breath. "You're not the only one who's been targeted. You've been a symbol of change, of progress. But I've been under pressure too. The people you've been arresting, they have connections. Powerful connections. People outside this town who have influence. And I've been getting threats. Not just against me, but against my family." Marcus's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't want to believe it, Marcus, but I have no choice now. There are people who've been pulling the strings from the start, and they don't want you here. They don't want any of this to work. They've been using Linda and the others as pawns in a much larger game. And those connections I'm talking about, they reach much further than you think." The mayor paused, his gaze hardening. "I've been trying to keep the peace for as long as I could. But now I think I'm in too deep. Marcus's mind was racing. This was the final twist, the revelation that had been lurking in the shadows all along. The mayor had been compromised, a part of a system that had been quietly undermining his efforts. What Marcus thought had been a battle against local resistance was actually a war against a much more dangerous, far-reaching network. And now the stakes had never been higher. As the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in, Marcus realized that his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The true battle for the soul of the town had only been revealed in fragments. The real fight, the one that would decide the future of the community, was about to get much, much darker. Marcus knew what he had to do. But with powerful forces working against him from every angle, the question remained, could he trust anyone? And who was truly on his side? Marcus stood motionless, processing the weight of Mayor Pierce's confession. The town he had pledged to protect, the community he had hoped to transform, was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The realization that the resistance he had faced was part of a much larger, deeply entrenched system sent a chill down his spine. The mayor, a figure he had thought of as a confidant, had been playing a dangerous game, trying to balance his own position while keeping the peace. But now, with the truth out in the open, Marcus understood. Pierce had been just as much a part of the system as Linda and the others who had conspired against him. The mayor's words echoed in Marcus's mind. Powerful connections, influences beyond the town. This wasn't just about small-town politics or personal vendettas. It was about power, control, and the kind of people who would do anything to maintain the status quo. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he considered his next move. He couldn't let Pierce's confession derail everything he had worked for. If anything, it solidified his resolve to bring down the network of corruption that had been festering behind the scenes. But he couldn't do it alone. The mayor, for all his faults, was still a political figure with influence, and Marcus needed him. Pierce, Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "This isn't about you or me anymore. This is about the future of this town. You've got a choice now. Either you help me take them down, or you walk away from it all." Pierce hesitated, the weight of his own choices hanging in the air. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had driven so many others to act in the shadows. The fear of losing control. But Marcus wasn't interested in controlling the town. He was interested in freeing it from the very system that had kept it chained. "I've already lost control," Pierce muttered, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't let this spiral any further. You're right. This isn't just about us anymore. I'll help you, but we need to act quickly." Marcus nodded, a mix of relief and determination flooding through him. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had the mayor's backing now. Together, they could dismantle the network of resistance and expose the corruption before it consumed everything. The first step was to take the evidence they had about the secret fund, the donations, and the web of influence stretching far beyond their small town, and bring it to light. Marcus contacted a trusted journalist from a regional newspaper, someone he knew would handle the story with integrity. The journalist, skeptical at first, agreed to meet in secret, knowing this could be the story of the decade. Over the next few days, They worked to document everything: the paper trails, the connections between the conspirators, and the way their influence had slowly poisoned the town. When the story finally broke, it sent shockwaves through the town and the region. The police chief, once seen as the problem, was now being hailed as the hero. The revelation of the network of corruption, fueled by wealthy outside donors and local collaborators, was enough to change the town's entire landscape. Linda Thompson, along with several other key players, were arrested and charged with conspiracy, corruption, and even murder. The town was in turmoil, but it was the kind of turmoil that birthed change. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself at the center of a political storm. Protests and rallies were held, some in support of him and others in bitter opposition. But the more he saw of the people rallying behind him, the more he realized that the seeds of change had already been planted. Yes, there were still those who feared his leadership, who wanted to tear him down, but the tide was shifting. The truth had been revealed, and the town could no longer ignore the deep divisions that had festered beneath the surface. In the months that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within the community. He organized town halls, listened to the concerns of residents, and worked with community leaders to heal the rifts that had been exposed by the scandal. It wasn't an easy road. Trust, once broken, takes time to restore. But Marcus remained committed to the idea that true leadership wasn't about power. It was about service. About bringing people together, even in the face of their darkest fears. Mayor Pierce, for his part, resigned shortly after the revelations. His involvement in the corruption scandal was too much for the town to forgive. But in his resignation speech, he publicly endorsed Marcus, acknowledging that the change the town needed could only come from someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. It was a bittersweet moment for Marcus. He knew the mayor's resignation wouldn't be enough to repair the damage done, but it was a step in the right direction. As time passed, Marcus's leadership began to reshape the town. Crime rates slowly dropped, community engagement improved, and the once divided town started to come together. The deep, unspoken tensions didn't disappear overnight, but Marcus had learned one thing during the darkest moments of the investigation. Change was a slow burn, and it took time to erase years of division. But it was happening. Little by little, the town that had once been so bitterly divided was beginning to heal. And Marcus, the man who had been doubted, feared, and even attacked, stood as a symbol of hope for a future that was still in the making. On the day the trial for the conspirators began, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, watching the people file in. He felt a sense of finality, the culmination of everything he had fought for. As he turned to walk back to his car, he was greeted by a small group of residents who had come to thank him. A woman, whose family had lived in the town for generations, stepped forward. "You did it, Chief," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You gave us a chance to be something better. We owe you everything." Marcus smiled, the weight of the past months heavy on his shoulders, but lightened by this one moment of genuine gratitude. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the town, the sun beginning to set behind the hills. The town was scared, yes, but it was alive. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice steady. "But this town, this community, it's not about me. It's about all of us. We've all got a part to play in making sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past." As he walked away, the sound of the crowd's quiet applause echoed in his ears. It wasn't the loud cheers of victory, but the soft murmurs of a community that was beginning to believe again. They had been through a storm, and they had come out the other side, bruised but stronger. The real work was still ahead of him, but for the first time, Marcus felt that the future was something he could face with confidence. The town wasn't perfect, but it was on the path to becoming something better. And for the first time in his life, Marcus felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. The fight wasn't over, but the first chapter of his journey was complete. And as he looked to the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. The town was ready for the change that was coming. And so was he.